Hi folks, and welcome to our video lesson on Hugo Munsterberg and his psychological aesthetics. These video lessons will be demonstrations of ways to integrate the film theory with the films that we're watching, and they'll also hopefully clarify some of the larger points that the theorists are trying to make and try to situate them within an intellectual discourse of film theory, right? How do they relate to other film theorists? So let's just think about how to approach Munsterberg by thinking of a few key terms, right? Munsterberg is a psychologist by trade. He is doing psychological research, and he calls his book, The Photoplay, a psychological study. Photoplay merely being the term for cinematographic fictions before terms like movies took over. And I want to kind of title this Film as Mind, Munsterberg's Psychological Aesthetics. So I immediately want to think of these two terms, psychology and aesthetics, the psychological and the aesthetic, because they're very much the two terms that explicitly organize Munsterberg's thought in this book. How do we distinguish these two terms? The psychological has to do with the nature of the human mind and how it functions, and the aesthetic generally means the nature of art and beauty. Immediately you can see that Munsterberg organizes his book into two major sections, the first being the psychology of the photoplay and the second being the aesthetics of the photoplay. Our question will be, how does he integrate these two approaches? And the most difficult and maybe interesting part of Munsterberg's project is how he thinks of these two things as going together. Now we can kind of simplify what he's trying to do by going back to those sets of questions that we talked about in our first video lesson, the basics of what classical film theory is interested in. Two major questions that will recur throughout these first 6 weeks, over and over. What is cinema, and what does it do? And what makes cinema distinct from the other arts? The initial question that Munsterberg is going to ask throughout his book is the question, how is film distinct from theater? He's implicitly responding to a series of assumptions and canonical arguments that film, especially in this early narrative period of silent era film, is merely quote-unquote canned theater, that it's taking one medium, theatrical fiction, and simply putting it into a recording, that it is not, say, developing its own techniques. Munsterberg, writing in 1916, or he publishes this in 1916, is trying to respond in many different ways to say, no, film in many ways is distinct from theater, it is its own medium. He begins this question with the section depth and movement. He'll say, do the photoplays furnish us only a photographic reproduction of a stage performance? Is their aim thus simply to be an inexpensive substitute for the real theater? Or do the moving pictures bring us an independent art controlled by aesthetic laws of its own, working with mental appeals which are fundamentally different from those of the theater, with a sphere of its own and with ideal aims of its own? This is really useful because these questions are not something that we often think about today with cinema. It's not a question that we think needs answering. But at the time that Munsterberg is writing, the aesthetic merit of the entire medium is indeed a question to be posed. And Munsterberg is asking that very question just to show the stakes of the argument. And it's a rhetorical question. His answer to this will be absolutely moving pictures bring us an independent art. And he's going to methodically explain how that is. So I just want you to think about the history in which Munsterberg is writing. There is indeed a period of early silent narrative cinema in which the aesthetics of cinema generally resemble the aesthetics of the stage. We're talking about something like Tom Tom the Piper's Son by Billy Blitzer from 1905, or if you're familiar with the works of Georges Méliès, which were emerging around this time. This is after 1895 and through 1900, the kind of years of the actuality films of the Lumieres, right? Putting the camera in front of a train arriving at the station, and more toward the, say, first 6-7 years, remember the first 6 years of the 20th century, 1900 to 1906. You're getting kind of what we might call now a kind of primitive theatrical stage-like aesthetic without classical continuity editing. But as Munsterberg is writing, he's getting the revolution in classical continuity editing that you'll get with things like this in D.W. Griffith's The Lone-Dale Operator. The idea that you can cut from a wide view to a close-up to simulate our attention, right? So just understand that these years are critical not just in the development of narrative cinema, but also in the development of cinematographic and editing techniques that Munsterberg is going to hit on in his book. So if the initial question that Munsterberg is asking is how is film distinct from theater, he poses two possible answers. The psychological answer being the mental functioning of the cinema spectator is distinct from that of the theater spectator. The aesthetic answer being the aesthetic properties and techniques of the cinema are distinct from that of the theater. We're going to think later about how he merges these two poles. But let's dip into the book itself and just look at how it's composed. So this is the contents of the book, but I only asked you to read these two parts, a little bit from the psychology and a little bit from the aesthetics. Let's start with depth and movement. So think about depth and movement as answering this question. How are depth and movement in film distinct from that of the theater? Munsterberg is a psychologist, and he's interested in a school of psychology that is popular around the early 20th century known as Gestalt psychology. He actually draws on some Gestalt psychology. We're going to talk a little bit more about what Gestalt psychology is next week with Rudolf Arnheim. But he actually describes experiments, optical experiments such as this one. The idea being that what we're seeing in the movement of left, right of this red stick, what we're not seeing is a real movement. We're seeing what a Gestalt psychologist would call apparent movement. I know very well that what I'm seeing are alternate flashes of a rectangle, but my mind creates the impression of moving left to right. There is supposed to be a bit of an analogy between the apparent movement of this stick and the apparent illusion of motion in cinema synthesized from a succession of still images moving at 24 frames per second, or 16 frames per second, depending on the era of cinema you're talking about. Now, the point that Munsterberg wants to make here, and the point that he'll make throughout his book, is just to remind us how much our mind is synthesizing, adding, creating aspects of what we think of as objectively there phenomena in the world. He'll say the movement is, and say the movement in this Gestalt psychology example, not really seen from without, but is superadded by the action of the mind to motionless pictures, right? So this works for this image, and it works for the general principle of the cinematographic illusion of movement at 24 frames per second. Now we can think of La Jetée as a film that almost wants to give us the story and convince us of this illusion at the same time, right? Think about moments like this. La Jetée, a famous film for telling us a story but not giving us the illusion of 24 frames per second, almost at some moments teaches us of the phenomenon of apparent movement by giving us short bursts of images that, when closely related to each other, start to signify, or rather start to give the perceptual impression of fluid movement. Notice just how much this almost looks as if we can feel the bounce of his step in those quickly successive images. And the story with depth, as opposed to movement, is very much the same kind of argument. Munsterberg will say we see actual depth in the pictures, and yet we are every instant aware that it is not real depth, and that the persons are not really plastic. It's an analogous argument, because he wants to say that we see movement in moving images, and yet we know that what we're not seeing is actual movement, but an illusion of it. In the same way that we see a kind of depth in moving images, but we know that it's not actual depth, as if we could reach into the screen and touch the objects that are represented before us. And I also want to say that La Jetée is a film that illustrates this impression of depth similarly by taking away the natural impression of depth that is a byproduct of 24 frames per second movement. How does it do that? Well, it has one very special moment in the film where it gives us that cinematic movement, so we can understand what it is phenomenologically that occurs when you go from, say, the representation of a moving person through a succession of blocky images to the illusion of cinematographic movement, how that differs. So take this famous moment.
Lui ne sait jamais s'il se dirige vers elle, s'il est dirigé, s'il invente ou s'il rêve.
So what we can say here is that in a moment like this, in which we see what happens to the image when actual 24 frames per second movement is added to the image, it's almost as if what Munsterberg does for the illusion of depth in film versus theater in his analytical prose, Jetee does for the illusion of depth in film versus photography, or rather a succession of photographs. And in fact, we'll get film theorists like Christian Metz, who does a kind of phenomenology of motion much later in the history of film theory. And he'll say things that very much corroborate the intuition of Munsterberg about this idea of depth being felt but not actual in a moving image. And Metz does a really nice job. I just want to bring him in to kind of support Munsterberg's perceptual claims. So Metz will say motion imparts corporality to objects and gives them an autonomy their still representations could not have. It draws them from their flat surfaces to which they were confined, allowing them to stand out better as figures against a background. Freed from its setting, the object is substantiated. Movement brings us volume, and volume suggests life. What I want to simply show is illustrate properties that are natural to cinema, and Jetee is a film that makes us appreciate or see anew those properties by taking them away. And these properties are exactly what Munsterberg is trying to articulate is happening in movies, not as opposed to photography, but as opposed to theater. The depth in theater is real. The depth in movies is apparent and synthesized by our mind. And that's why he thinks it's interesting and important. So, and this is where he'll summarize. He'll tell you why he thinks it's important. So once again, the question, how are depth and movement in film distinct from that of theater? He'll say, what is then the difference between seeing motion in the photography, in the photoplay, and seeing it on the real stage? There on the stage where the actors move, the eye really receives a continuous series. But if he faces the film world, the motion which he sees is created by his own mind. Depth and movement alike come to us in the moving picture world, not as hard facts, but as a mixture of fact and symbol. They are present, and yet they are not in the things. We invest the impressions with them. Once again, this is a rallying cry of his book. He wants you to become aware of, when you're viewing and spectating a moving image, how much of what is going on is superadded by your own cognitive faculties. So let's keep that in mind as we move to the more famous and more well-regarded of his sections in the psychology section on attention. Now he'll ask the same question of our faculty of attention. How is attention in film distinct from that of the theater? So he'll say something like this. The close-up has done what no theater could have offered by its own means, though we might have approached the effect from the theater performance if we had taken our opera glass and had directed it only to those two heads. But by doing so, we should have emancipated ourselves from the offering of the stage picture. That is, the concentration and focusing were secured by us and not by the performance. So it's really just a kind of convoluted way of saying that yes, you can create a close-up, a manifestation of attention in theater, but you would be doing it. Here he's saying that film has baked into its aesthetic possibilities a representation of attention. He'll say that a close-up like this one is in some sense a representation of what our minds already do. It is as if a close-up is a exteriorization of what only happens in the interior mind. That is a bringing of something to the foreground of our attention. And very much he'll do the same thing with his claims about memory and imagination and the flashback. So he'll ask the same question: how are memory and imagination in film distinct from that of theater? He'll answer, in short, the photoplay can act as our imagination acts. It has the mobility of our ideas, which are not controlled by the physical necessity of outer events, but by the psychological laws for the association of ideas. In our mind, past and future become intertwined with the present. The photoplay obeys the laws of the mind rather than those of the outer world. So he'll look at something like this. Of course, this is happening decades after he's watching, but it's a pretty prototypical example of what a flashback looks like. In Casablanca, we stare at Humphrey Bogart. He looks away. A kind of blurry wash occurs over his image, and then we dissolve into a space that we immediately recognize as not taking us literally to a place, but picturing his mental contents. For Munsterberg, this is an important faculty of cinema because it represents something our minds already do. The fact that we can indeed, when we are perceiving the world, have moments in which my mind can be interrupted by a flashback, a memory, that this happens in a fluid and natural way, and cinema has the means of exteriorizing these interior processes. And he'll say, the act which in the ordinary theater would go on in our mind alone is here in the photography projected into the pictures themselves. It is as if reality has lost its own continuous connection and become shaped by the demands of our soul. So in our next video, we're going to ask the question, why does any of this matter, right? He's made it very clear that the cinema uniquely does this thing that theater can't do, which is that it exteriorizes the mental faculties, and it also forces our minds to contribute to our making sense of the image through what the cognitive faculties super add to make sense of apparent motion and apparent depth. But why does this matter? That's the exciting part, and we'll talk about that in the next video.